everyone, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. In today's session, we study chapters 18 and 19 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, The Weighing of the Wands, and the Hungarian Horntail, as Harry is isolated from his community, from his communities, in fact. We're going to look at the way in which Harry is a member of multiple communities in Hogwarts, as we all are, of course. Harry has his core friendship group. He has Ron and Hermione, of course. That now is somewhat splintered, somewhat fragmented. Then, of course, he is a member of Gryffindor. His position there, more secure, perhaps, than in his other communities, but still not perfectly secure. And then, of course, there's his place in the school in general, which is now under some scrutiny, now under some adverse attention from the other students and indeed from the faculty too. More on that as we move through today's reading, as we also discuss identity and authority and the ways in which the rules apply and do not apply to exceptional children. More on that as we get into the latter of our two chapters today. But we begin with the beginning of chapter 18, The Weighing of the Wands, where we discover that things are still not right between Harry and Ron. They went downstairs, crossed the entrance hall quickly without looking in at the great hall, and were soon striding across the lawn toward the lake, where the Durmstrang ship was moored, reflected blackly in the water. It was a chilly morning, and they kept moving, munching their toast, as Harry told Hermione exactly what had happened after he left the Gryffindor table the night before. To his immense relief, Hermione accepted his story without question. "Well, of course I knew you hadn't entered yourself," she said when he'd finished telling her about the scene in the chamber off the hall. "The look on your face when Dumbledore read out your name. But the question is, who did put it in? Because Moody's right, Harry. I don't think any student could have done it. They'd never be able to fool the goblet or get over Dumbledore's—" "Have you seen Ron?" Harry interrupted. Hermione hesitated. Yes. He was at breakfast," she said. "Does he still think I entered myself?" "Well, no, I don't think so. Not really," said Hermione, awkwardly. "What's that supposed to mean, not really?" "Oh, Harry, isn't it obvious?" Hermione said despairingly. "He's jealous." An effective subtitle for this series would just be Hermione said, "Oh, Harry, isn't it obvious?" I feel as though that's a common refrain here. And here we see an interesting piece of personal disassociation for Harry, right? He wakes up in the morning with this weight of anxiety, this weight of pressure on his chest. Now that he has been appointed the school champion, or one of the two school champions for Hogwarts, he is fearful of what the Triwizard Tournament will entail. He is fearful of what it is that awaits him. And yet here, as he finally finds someone who believes him, as he finally finds someone who can give him valuable advice and offer a perspective on this entire experience, he pivots back to Ron. What is more important to Harry right now? Well, over the course of the next two chapters, and really over the course of the rest of this book, we are going to see Harry reappraise his time at Hogwarts. You'll remember earlier in the book how I called out these moments of odd ambiguity with regard to Harry's relationship with Hogwarts. He is sulky and willful about the return to Hogwarts after the school holidays, right? For the first time ever, he's looking at the end of the school holidays as being the taking away of something valuable. And that is because, of course, in part, he is integrated with his community. Now he has found his found family in the Weasleys, and he's having a good time there. But also, he has begun to normalize his Hogwarts experience. This is a completely normal adolescent process. But Harry is now going to be given a rare and unusual gift. A gift that certainly comes with a hefty price tag, a price tag of mortal danger, in fact, as so many of the price tags attached to Harry's experiences are. But he is going to be gifted this experience that allows him to look back at the mundanity of his school life with a certain warmth, with a certain affection. By the end of today's reading, he is going to be wishing that things were normal again. This thing that had become so familiar, so contemptible in its familiarity, that he was looking for, searching for, striving for something else, anything else to illuminate his life, that he was wanting something more from his time at Hogwarts. Well, now that he's been given something more from his time at Hogwarts, he realizes just how valuable that normality was. That's going to be an ongoing pressure as we move through the rest of the book. And this is, in many ways, a powerful turning point in Harry's experience. He, in the first instance, looking at the first two books, really, loves his time at Hogwarts because it is new, yes, and because it is a kind of home. It is a kind of family, a kind of community which he has never known, both in the abstract and in the very intimate, because his time at Hogwarts is a connecting thread back to his parents' time at Hogwarts. This is a way of him being in the company of his family, both in a biological sense and in a broader magical sense, right? That has guided Harry through his first 2 years at Hogwarts. We begin to see that transition in the third year, where the cracks begin to open with regard to his experience at Hogwarts. Now, in the book up to this point, in Goblet of Fire, up to this point, we've seen him be a little sulky about his time at Hogwarts, and we've seen some of the shine come off his experiences here. Now, it is true that there is still an antagonism between Harry and Snape, for example, but his experience of potions class is more than that. Potions class is just a bad class, and it is bad in a dreary, drudgery, mundane, just academic sense. This is not a class that Harry enjoys, and it's not a class that he doesn't enjoy because of this high-octane operatic conflict between himself and Snape. It's because he just doesn't really like, well, I should say it is that, but it's also just that he doesn't really like potions class. He also doesn't really like divinations class. Again, because there is this element of death and foreboding. We get the great read in the middle of this chapter that Sybil Trelawney is predicting his death with more frequency than usual, right? This thing that already happens in every single divinations class is now becoming all the more frequent, but there is something more here. Harry is on the cusp of an adolescent experience, but the adolescent experience that he's receiving is not quite the adolescent experience that the other children are receiving, including Ron. You'll remember right back at the beginning of the book when Harry wakes from that terrible dream with his scar hurting, and he immediately runs through the list of people that he can contact. I could talk to Ron and he would say this. I could talk to Hermione and she would say this. I could talk to Dumbledore, but that would be crazy. Hey, I should write a letter to Sirius, but then immediately back out of that too. Hermione proves in this next slide that Harry understands her very well, in fact, because she does pretty much exactly what he predicted back at the beginning of the book. Look, said Hermione patiently, it's always you who gets all the attention. You know it is. I know it's not your fault, she added quickly, seeing Harry open his mouth furiously. I know you don't ask for it, but, well, you know, Ron's got all these brothers to compete against at home, and you're his best friend, and you're really famous. He's always shunted to one side whenever people see you, and he puts up with it, and he never mentions it. But I suppose this is just one time too many. Great, said Harry bitterly. Really great. Tell me from him I'll swap any time he wants. Tell him from me that he's welcome to it. People gawping at my forehead everywhere I go. I'm not telling him anything, Hermione said shortly. Tell him yourself. It's the only way to sort this out. I'm not running around after him trying to make him grow up, Harry said, so loudly that several owls in a nearby tree took flight in alarm. Maybe he'll believe I'm not enjoying myself once I get my neck broken, or... That's not funny, Hermione said quietly. That's not funny at all. She looked extremely anxious. Harry, I've been thinking... You know what we've got to do, don't you? Straight away, the moment we get back to the castle? Yeah, give Ron a good kick up there. Right to Sirius. You've got to tell him what's happened. He asked you to keep him posted on everything that's going on at Hogwarts. It's almost as though he expected something like this to happen. I brought some parchment and a quill out with me. Come off it, said Harry, looking around to check they couldn't be overheard, but the grounds were quite deserted. He came back to the country just because my scar twinged. He's probably going to come bursting right into the castle if I tell him someone's entered me in the Triwizard Tournament. He'd want you to tell him, Hermione said sternly. He's going to find out anyway. How? Harry, this isn't going to be kept quiet, said Hermione very seriously. The tournament's famous and you're famous. I'd be really surprised if there isn't anything in the Daily Prophet about you competing. You're already in half the books about you know who you know, and Sirius would rather hear it from you. I know he would. Hermione giving good counsel here. Hey, Harry, this is weird. And it's not just weird in an interpersonal way, and it's not just weird in a private tragedy kind of way. It's weird in a large-scale, big-picture, something mysterious is afoot in the wizarding world kind of way, and it is your responsibility to tell Sirius. But Hermione also has a perspective on Ron Weasley. And we talked a little about this at the end of last week's session, where we studied Ron's response, what it is textually that Ron is objecting to. And the book itself is going to pivot a little bit, and that doesn't mean that our interpretation of Ron's initial response to Harry's appointment as a champion for the Triwizard Tournament is awry, is erroneous, because we looked very carefully at those passages and distilled out the meaning that we could find within them. It doesn't mean that Hermione is wrong, however. It's entirely possible that these two impulses can coexist. To recap, Ron is upset not that Harry has broken the rules, not that he has entered the Triwizard Tournament, not even that he has been selected as a champion. Ron is, at the end of the last chapter, upset that Harry, A, didn't include him, and B, didn't tell him, and then ultimately C, is apparently lying to him. Now, Ron is ready to believe these things, presumably because of this jealousy that Hermione is backfilling on our understanding of Ron Weasley. And really, there's very little indication that this has been true, and yet I'm still completely compelled by Hermione's argument here. This still seems to fit the Ron Weasley that we've seen over the course of the last few chapters. Carmine here in the chat says, the part with Hermione explaining psychology to the boys always reminds me of the reality of emotional labor and how women are forced into doing it. I kind of want to bang Ron and Harry's heads together throughout these chapters. And this is not the last time that we're going to be dealing with this. If you guys have read ahead to Deathly Hallows, for example, you'll know that a division very similar to this one is going to be a fundamental breaking point in that book. And it is frustrating. It is in parts infuriating. And the way that they handle it between themselves is, you're absolutely right, Carmine, I think plays into those worst traditions of men being emotionally unavailable and women having to do the emotional heavy lifting. I think you're absolutely right that it falls on the women with whom we have relationships, the women with whom these men have relationships, to build bridges, to patch up emotional damage, to restore what there is to be restored, all the while being derided for that, right? The way that Harry responds to Hermione in the next chapter of our reading is really undeserving, objectively undeserving. Hermione has done nothing to deserve his critique here. And when he is mocking her in the mode of missing Ron, or missing Ron in the mode of mocking her, right? When he's handling this very complicated kind of sense of absence in this very complicated emotional landscape, yes, a lot of this falls on Hermione, and she genuinely doesn't deserve it. And that brings us to a really interesting point that is repeated several times through these chapters. This notion that Harry does not deserve the circumstances of his life, that he has not sought this fame, that he has not sought this exceptionalism, and that this exceptionalism, more than being unsought, somehow afflicts him, that this is something that comes exclusively from outside of Harry and influences his life and influences the way that people respond to him. You'll see here at the beginning of this slide. I know it's not your fault, she added quickly, seeing Harry open his mouth furiously. I know you don't ask for it. Well, true, kind of. I mean, the circumstances of Harry's, well, I suppose not birth, but orphaning are outside of his control, right? The circumstances of his fame, the circumstances of his scar, these things are actually outside of his control. But Harry has never sought to diminish his fame or diminish the notoriety that he has achieved here at Hogwarts, that he has achieved throughout, or been granted, the notoriety that has been placed upon him in the wider wizarding world. Harry has always been perfectly happy to parlay his exceptionalism into unconventional adventures at Hogwarts and now beyond Hogwarts. He is more than willing to take authority into his own hands, and that authority is given to him, is allowed to be claimed by him because of that exceptionalism. Like, Harry's fame does come with a price, but it is a price that Harry pretty thoroughly has been willing to pay. But here in these chapters, we continually emphasize how this is not his fault. Later, he's going to send an owl to, right at the end of the chapter, in fact, he's going to send an owl to Sirius, finally telling Sirius what is going on. And right at the end of that exchange, Hedwig is going to be fussy, is going to be grumpy, is going to be somewhat put out with Harry because Harry is not using Hedwig to send a letter to Sirius. He's using a school owl to send a letter to Sirius for very compelling reasons. And Harry is going to protest, not you two, it's not my fault. Drawing a direct connection back to this experience, that it's not his fault that he was selected to be the champion of one of the Hogwarts champions for the Triwizard Tournament. I keep wanting to call him the Gryffindor champion, and I think that the book is leaning into that, but that, of course, we have to be more careful than that in our assessment of Harry at this point. This is not his fault. This entire set of circumstances, it's not his fault that he's been selected. It's not his fault that everyone hates him. It's not his fault that Sirius is in real danger, but also wants to help Harry. And technically speaking, this is true, but we are pretty thoroughly victimizing Harry. Another beat of this, right? Later, when he's talking with Hagrid, Hagrid will say, yeah, it's too bad that all of this has happened. These things always happen to you, don't they, Harry? And contrast that with the repeated beats that we got right back at the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban, where Mr. Weasley and Hagrid and Hermione all say to Harry, don't do anything. Like, don't make this worse. Don't get in trouble. Don't go further. Don't be Harry about this, okay? There, we're absolutely acknowledging for the first time in the series, yeah, Harry actually does have a habit of getting himself in trouble. He has a habit of crossing lines that ought not to be crossed, of taking unto himself an authority which isn't really rightfully his, that doesn't really rightfully belong to any adolescent. There's a reason that we bound and constrain the lives of adolescents, because they can't always be trusted to make smart adult choices. Of course, incidentally, nor can adults, but that's just a small tragedy of the wider world. But in Prisoner of Azkaban, we're absolutely giving Harry that agency. Hey, you know what? The whole Philosopher's Stone thing, okay, yes, you ended up in that circumstance, but then you took action. Chamber of Secrets thing too, and now we're dealing with some kind of, I don't know, Azkabanian prisoner, Harry. Don't make it worse. Don't go looking for this guy. Just don't be you. Here, we're absolutely inverting that. We're saying, yeah, sorry, Harry, it's terrible that these things happen to you. We're sorry that you are a victim of this, that you are reacting to this, which plays into this sense of disempowered ennui that Harry has through most of this book, in fact. This idea that school is burdensome, that his entire adolescent experience is burdensome, that it is burdensome that Ron is jealous and kind of a jerk about it, that it is burdensome that Cho doesn't quite see him the way that he wants to be seen, that it is burdensome that he has been selected for this great honor and can't enjoy it, now is fearful of it, just because of circumstances outside of his control. We're going to continue to track that as we move forward. Yeah. Lynn says, I think it's a typical situation for a trio in school that mostly two are at ends with each other. That's why it often doesn't work in real life. Yeah, I think that this is the breaking point of the power trio, right? The power trio, when unified, is incredibly powerful. The power trio, when fractured, is incomplete. This is part of the problem. This is something that we do all the time in narrative, and it is something that we really ought to strive to avoid in real life, right? This is one of the ways in which fictional characters are very different from real life people. In fiction, we oftentimes connect our characters in little relationship geometries, right? We will hook our characters up together so that they are more complete and more powerful. We've talked about this a lot with the ethos, pathos, logos argument concerning Harry, Ron, and Hermione, that Harry, as a force of unconstrained ethos, is incomplete, and he needs smart Hermione and passionate Ron right there with him to make him a more rounded person. That would be terrible in real life. That is a kind of absolutely toxic codependency in real life, which, for all that it is awful, is still a real part of a lot of people's lives. But this is, yes, one of the things that we should strive to avoid, but one of the things which does work in fiction, whether you're talking about a power trio or you're talking about, a romantic hero-heroine relationship, or hero-hero, heroine-heroine, there's no reason to gender that dynamic at all. But whether you're talking about a romantic relationship at the heart of a story where, the classic Jerry Maguire, you complete me, right? That is effective within the frame of the narrative. They are absolutely destructive in real life. And the same is true of power trio relationships, of five-man band relationships, of even some, found family relationships that we get in fiction. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of found family narratives, but not always the most healthy. Not always the most healthy. Sometimes just a little codependent there. Yeah. And Angela observing here in the chat too that Hermione has grown so much in the last books, and her emotional empathy and compassion has so much more growth to endure. That is a really valuable point, I think, to recognize just how far Hermione has come. Not even that she is capable of doing this emotional heavy lifting, which, again, should not fall on her and is absolutely emblematic of a kind of toxic and emotionally stunted masculinity that we see, which is at least more forgivable in adolescent boys than it is in grown men in the real world, but nonetheless still all too common. She is capable of doing this now, but more than her capability, we also see her connectivity has grown. Her understanding of the importance of relationships has grown. Once again, I find myself really wanting the Harry Potter series from Hermione's POV. Like, that is a story that I think would be at least every bit as compelling as Harry's, probably more compelling. Hermione has a really great story going on. So let's keep going and see the root here of Harry's isolation here at Hogwarts. If Harry had thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of him being champion, the following day showed him how mistaken he was. He could no longer avoid the rest of the school once he was back at lessons. It was clear that the rest of the school, just like the Gryffindors, thought Harry had entered himself for the tournament. Unlike the Gryffindors, however, they did not seem impressed. The Hufflepuffs, who were usually on excellent terms with the Gryffindors, had turned remarkably cold toward the whole lot of them. One herbology lesson was enough to demonstrate this. It was plain that the Hufflepuffs felt that Harry had stolen their champion's glory, a feeling exacerbated perhaps by the fact that Hufflepuff House very rarely got any glory, and that Cedric was one of the few who had ever given them any, having beaten Gryffindor once at Quidditch. Ernie Macmillan and Justin Finch-Fletchley, with whom Harry normally got on very well, did not talk to him, even though they were repotting bouncing bulbs at the same tray, though they did laugh rather unpleasantly when one of the bouncing bulbs wriggled free from Harry's grip and smacked him hard in the face. Ron wasn't talking to Harry either. Hermione sat between them, making very forced conversation, but though both answered her normally, they avoided making eye contact with each other. Harry even thought Professor Sprout seemed distant with him, but then she was head of Hufflepuff House. It is, of course, completely appropriate that Professor Sprout should be cool toward Harry at this point, regardless of the fact that Professor Sprout is an adult and faculty here at Hogwarts, and Harry is a kid and a student. But of course, house loyalty is awfully important. And the problem with Hufflepuffs is just that they don't get enough glory. It is absolutely appropriate for a Gryffindor kid to identify the problem here, not as one of injustice, not as one of rule breaking, but insufficient glory to go around. And now Harry is taking some of Cedric's share. Isn't that just terrible? Really great subtle beat here that I absolutely love. Ernie Macmillan and Justin Finch-Fletchley, with whom Harry normally got on very well, did not talk to him. We've talked about Ernie and Justin before, of course, as being, respectively, the Ron and Harry of their little Hufflepuff power trio, with Hannah Abbott taking the Hermione Granger role in that little trio there. This is a great beat. I don't know to what degree J.K. Rowling had this in mind, that of all the kids in the school that she could call out now, she calls out the closest parallel to Ron and Harry, that they are together and working together, even as Harry and Ron are disconnected from one another. But I really love that little beat there. We also see a little bit of Harry's adolescent grudge, I suppose, here against the rest of the school. And you'll notice how we keep repeating that phrase, the rest of the school, how Harry is, in a sense, othering himself. Now, that's not completely one-sided. The school is othering Harry and has consistently othered Harry since his very first day at Hogwarts. There is the student body of Hogwarts, and then there's Harry Potter, right? He is special, he is gifted, but Harry is now recognizing this, the rest of the school. If Harry had thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of him being champion, the following day showed him how mistaken he was. If Harry had thought, and note how the narration frames this as a hypothetical, if Harry had thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of him being champion, the following day showed him how mistaken he was. Oh yeah, no, it's been like a solid 24 hours now and people aren't over this? What am I supposed to do? Clearly the problem is them, not me. They haven't got over it. They haven't figured out what's happening here. They haven't accepted that this is just the way things are. He could no longer avoid the rest of the school once he was back at lessons. It was clear that the rest of the school, just like the Gryffindors, thought Harry had entered himself for the tournament. Unlike the Gryffindors, however, they did not seem impressed. The Hufflepuffs in particular here backing away from Harry because of, to Harry's mind, this question of glory, though. Again, we might be interested in observing the ways that Hufflepuffs interact with each other and interact with the rest of the school. There's never been a sense that Hufflepuffs are aggrieved by the Gryffindors' desire for glory. Usually, the Hufflepuffs and the Gryffindors are in pretty close alliance against Slytherin, particularly when it comes to sporting events. And the Hufflepuffs presumably don't mind that the Gryffindors are out there grabbing all the glory that they can. They seem genuinely supportive, which of course you would expect from Hufflepuffs. This, though, is Harry's account of the division that has drawn here. A division which ultimately brings us to Potter stinks, brings us to this rallying cry for the Slytherin and Hufflepuff kids. I guess the Ravenclaw kids, too, might feel a little bit aggrieved by this, but we're just not sure about that. But it's... Irina's joining us. Sorry, I saw a little message here pop up in the chat. I was trying to find it because the chat started to scroll. Irina is joining us. Irina says, first time I'm able to catch one of these live. Yay for European-friendly broadcast. Video and sound are a bit wonky still, but at least I'm here. I'm terribly sorry. I hope that the video and sound are working out. Everything looks good here, but, for these magical messages to wing their way across the Atlantic can be taxing on them, poor things. At least we don't have to communicate via OWL. I did want to pull all the way back. No, the chat has scrolled too far and now I can't find it, but do go and find some Potter Stinks badges online. They're actually very cute. I have seen a lenticular badge, those little very simple ridged holograms that present one image from one direction and then another image from another direction. I have seen a lenticular version of this badge, which is very cool, by the way. But Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I really want a Potter Stinks badge, and yet at the same time, I feel as though I wouldn't ever want to wear it. I wouldn't ever want to advertise that. Let's get to Potter Stinks, shall we? When he and Hermione arrived at Snape's dungeon after lunch, they found the Slytherins waiting outside, each and every one of them wearing a large badge on the front of his or her robes. For one wild moment, Harry thought they were SPEW badges. Then he saw they all bore the same message in luminous red letters that burnt brightly in the dimly lit underground passage. Support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion! Like them, Potter, said Malfoy loudly as Harry approached. And this isn't all they do. Look! He pressed his badge into his chest, and the message upon it vanished, to be replaced by another one, which glowed green. Potter stinks. The Slytherins howled with laughter. Each of them pressed their badges too, until the message Potter stinks was shining brightly all around Harry. He felt the heat rise in his face and neck. "Oh, very funny," Hermione said sarcastically to Pansy Parkinson and her gang of Slytherin girls who were laughing harder than anyone. "Really witty." Ron was standing against the wall with Dean and Seamus. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't sticking up for Harry either. "Want one, Granger?" said Malfoy, holding out a badge to Hermione. "I've got loads, but don't touch my hand now. I've just watched it, you see. Don't want a mudblood sliming it up." Some of the anger Harry had been feeling for days and days seemed to burst through a dam in his chest. He had reached for his wand before he thought what he was doing. People all around them scrambled out of the way, backing down the corridor. "Harry," Hermione said, warningly. The ambiguity of the badges is fascinating. The simple explanation of the badges is, of course, that Potter stinks would be somehow inappropriate for school, would bring down censure upon these kids from the faculty and staff of Hogwarts. But there's something more than that, too. This idea that support is singular, that support is unilateral in the sense of not being bilateral, right? That support can be given in its entirety only to one person. It is not possible to rally our support behind both of the Hogwarts champions. It is possible only to pick our favorite, to pick the rightful champion, Cedric Diggory, who passed the age line and put his own name into the Goblet of Fire and did everything right, did everything by the book, and Harry, who has somehow avoided, by dint of exceptionalism, the rules surrounding the Triwizard Tournament. And you'll see that transition there too, from the red of the support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion, to the green of Potter stinks. Pretty cruel, pretty evil, and here too we get Draco Malfoy offering Hermione a badge, suggesting very strongly, I think, that it is Malfoy himself who has, I don't know, fabricated these badges or has at least popularized these badges. "Want one, Granger?" said Malfoy, holding out a badge to Hermione. "I've got loads," implying that he has perhaps created these badges or sourced these badges or something, which shows, of course, this ruthlessly fluid set of loyalties contained within Slytherin. Yes, Draco Malfoy is absolutely willing to wear a badge proclaiming Cedric Diggory the Hogwarts champion, because Cedric Diggory is not Harry, and is not a Gryffindor kid, is not in opposition to Slytherin the way that Gryffindor is. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Absolutely page one of the, well, I was going to say page one of the Slytherin handbook, but really page one of that amalgamated, combined Sun Tzu's Art of War and Machiavelli's The Prince handbook that apparently they give out to all Slytherin children, or I guess all Slytherin children are just born knowing, ruthless and ambitious as they are. We then get the fight between Harry and Malfoy, the little wizard duel, wherein Harry casts Furnunculus, which is a spell that we haven't seen, neither of these spells we've seen before. Actually, Malfoy's spell we're never going to see again. This is its only appearance. We might be able to infer the existence of the Pimple Jinx Furnunculus in other parts of the series, but these are pretty much one-shot spells. So the Pimple Jinx Furnunculus is a jinx that causes a person to break out in boils. Furnuncle is a word for boil. It is an Old English word for boil, derived from the Latin word furnunculus, which means, interestingly, petty thief. A furnunculus is a petty thief. Malfoy's spell is Densogio, I guess we would pronounce that. I just realized that I hadn't ever pronounced that word out loud. Densogio is a hex, which causes the teeth to lengthen. And this is one of those few beats where we get actual physical description of Hermione, too, where the narrator acknowledges that Hermione's two front teeth are, in general, a little longer than they ought to be. Just they are slightly exceptional anyway for Hermione, but the spell just has a much greater effect there. This is derived from Latin dens, meaning tooth, of course, and augeo, which means to it's the same root word as to augment, to increase or to grow. These are the spells that are cast. And then we get the capper. Then we get the worst beat in the whole book when Snape shows up and is interrogating the children about what happened, and is, of course, freely accepting of the Slytherin side of the story and absolutely skeptical of the Gryffindor side of the story, and is then invited, after sending Crabbe off to the infirmary, is then invited to examine what Draco's spell did to Hermione. And we get this line: Snape looked coldly at Hermione, then said, "I see no difference." Hermione bursts into tears, understandably. And if we were in any way on the fence about Severus Snape, which I'm glad to say most of us at this point are not, and J.K. Rowling at this point was not, but it's a story for another time, I guess. Even if we were on the fence about Severus Snape at this point, that would absolutely damn him as a villain for the rest of the series, for the rest of eternity. What an awful, awful thing to do, to be so cold to Hermione. It's very bad, you guys. It's very bad, which is why I didn't pull it on a slide, because I just couldn't bring myself to read it. Joseph saying here in the chat, possibly the meanest thing done by Snape at any point. Yes. And Nikki pointing out, God, this is one of the moments that made me hate Snape more than ever. He is just trash here. This is, I suppose in a way, this does actually illuminate one of the interesting tensions here at Hogwarts, and one of the interesting textural changes here between the children and the adults. This is the kind of thing that Draco Malfoy does all the time. He just washed his hands and he doesn't want a mudblood to slime them up. Even just that constant use of the word mudblood to describe Hermione, that is utterly vile, utterly vile. And what Snape does is of a Malfoyian, I want to avoid using draconian, I suppose, but of a Malfoyian, a Malfoy-esque, a Malfoyic, I like better actually, a Malfoyic degree of cruelty, a degree of personal insult, of unearned and unsought personal insult. But because he is an adult, it is that much worse. And it's not just because he is an adult. It is worse because he is an adult, but it's also worse because he is in a nominal position of power here. And as a representation of the authoritarian structures and the legalistic structures of Hogwarts, we expect Snape to do better. We expect people who represent our civil structures to do better. That is why it is one thing for a man in the street to insult a passerby, and it is quite another for, an elected or appointed representative of the people to randomly insult someone in the street. These are two very different things, not because the crime itself is different, or the sin, the act, if I can strip that of morally resonant words. It's not because the act is different, it's because the expectation is different. And Snape here betrays our basic expectation, our basement expectation of what a teacher should be, what a teacher should do. Not for the first time, not for the last time. It's pretty terrible. Yeah. Okay, let's keep moving onward. We've still got a lot of ground to cover. In fact, let's take a look at how Harry feels about this after the fact. So we're told there that when Malfoy insults Hermione, this anger that has been building inside of Harry bursts. The dam bursts in his chest, and he has his wand in his hand before he even knows what he's doing, right? He's acting out of this aggressive and violent impulse here. He's acting out of anger. This is a fury that has taken him over, a fury at injustice, a fury that seems to be manifest because of stress and pressure and the injustice of that stress and pressure, and also because of the blame that is being placed upon him. He's reacting very differently. The narration draws a direct connection back to his experience in Chamber of Secrets, when the entire school turns against him because they believe that he has assaulted a fellow student. And the book draws the connection between these two experiences. But Harry's response here is very, very different. Harry's response here is much more heightened, in part because it's more personal, and, as the book acknowledges, because he doesn't have Ron's support here. Let's take a look at what happens inside the class. "Let's see," he said in his silkiest voice. 50 points from Gryffindor, and a detention each for Potter and Weasley. Now get inside, or it'll be a week's worth of detentions. Harry's ears were ringing. The injustice of it made him want to curse Snape into 1,000 slimy pieces. He passed Snape, walked with Ron to the back of the dungeon, and slammed his bag down onto the table. Ron was shaking with anger too. For a moment, it felt as though everything was back to normal between them. But then Ron turned and sat down with Dean and Seamus instead, leaving Harry alone at his table. On the other side of the dungeon, Malfoy turned his back on Snape and pressed his badge, smirking. Potter stinks flashed once more across the room. Harry sat there staring at Snape as the lesson began, picturing horrific things happening to him. If only he knew how to do the Cruciatus curse. He'd have Snape flat on his back like that spider, jerking and twitching. "Antidotes," said Snape, looking around at them all, his cold black eyes glittering unpleasantly. "You should all have prepared your recipes now. I want you to brew them carefully, and then we will be selecting someone on whom to test one." Snape's eyes met Harry's, and Harry knew what was coming. Snape was going to poison him. Harry imagined picking up his cauldron and sprinting to the front of the class and bringing it down on Snape's greasy head. And then a knock on the dungeon door burst in on Harry's thoughts. This is something else entirely. This is unprecedented, I think, for Harry Potter. This desire to cause harm, to cause violence upon another, even upon the head of Severus Snape, is shocking. And the specific moment when Harry invokes one of the unforgivable curses here, as a fantasy, of course, as a lightning rod for his fury, as a means of expressing some of that fury, even if only internally. But when we mention one of the unforgivable curses, which we have just established are the worst things that a wizard can do to another human being, here, Harry wanting to do that to Snape is completely new, is completely unparalleled. And you'll note too here that there is no distinction between Harry as a student and Snape as a teacher, as an adult, as a professor here. There's no line of authority. There is no civil or legalistic distinction between Harry and Snape here, not from Harry's POV. The way that he talks about assaulting Snape and doing violence unto him is exactly the same way that he would talk about doing violence to Malfoy, for example. You'll note here that we do get a possible proof that the ability of the badges to change their message and to disguise themselves is actually a function of fear of authoritarian censure from the faculty of Hogwarts here. On the other side of the dungeon, Malfoy turned his back on Snape and pressed his badge, smirking. Potter stinks flashed once more across the room. It's unlikely that Snape would care that his badge says Potter stinks, but Malfoy here is still on the juvenile side of the seesaw, right? He is still on that side of the line in a way that Harry is not. And of course, the story of adolescence, as I've said before, adolescence is not a journey across a simple line. The reason that we describe adolescence as a liminal state is that you are suspended between these two things. You are no longer a child and you are not yet an adult, but that doesn't mean that you are something completely different. It means that you swing wildly back and forth between these two things. You exist throughout the entirety of that differentiated space between the two extremes of your adolescent experience. Harry here has crossed whatever emotional and social Rubicon there is at the heart. Well, I guess not actually a Rubicon. That's the least appropriate metaphor that I could have picked there, because the point of crossing the Rubicon was that you couldn't take it back, of course. And Harry is going to take it back. Harry is going to be thrust back across this river, back across this threshold here at the heart of his adolescent experience, as we all are numerous times. But Draco Malfoy is behaving as a child, and Harry is not. Again, we might be concerned about the agency and authority that Harry is taking unto himself. This is in part the reason that he has these adventures, is because he is willing to act in a way that is empowered by his exceptionalism, but is fueled by, well, charitably, we might say it is fueled by his desire to do good. Charitably, we might say it is even fueled by his Gryffindorian virtue of heroism, right? Of his bravery, of his courage. These are the virtues that we associate with Gryffindor kids and with Harry in particular. But less charitably, we might speculate if Harry's desire to be exceptional, Harry's desire to take action that he is not really socially empowered to take, or is socially empowered to take only by dint of his celebrity, that his desire to do this comes from a desire for fame, for power, or even just a belief that he is the only one capable, which is itself a naturally destructive, this is socially speaking, it is a naturally destructive inclination. It's a naturally destructive belief. If you believe that you are the only one capable of doing something, That may even be true, but if you believe that you are the only one capable of undertaking a particular task, that is naturally a stress upon your relationships with others. And in the broadest sense, it is a societally and culturally and communally destructive force. This is one of the reasons why classical heroes like Theseus and Hercules, these heroes are challenging to our understanding of conventional society, not because they are in active opposition to conventional society, but because they stand outside of it. And by anchoring lines of responsibility and agency from the inside of this intricate and complicated web of social relationship and social engagement, by anchoring some of these points outside of the web to characters like Harry Potter, to characters like Heracles, say, then we are stressing that internal tension. The society itself is made weaker, in a sense, by the existence of these heroes. Now, that may not be a bad thing. We may not believe that what we want is a completely solid and robust society, an inflexible and fixed society. That may not, in fact, he said meaningfully at the camera, be what we want all the time. We might want to have characters like Harry provide a certain flux and a certain internal dynamism. That is how change comes about. That is how revolutions happen. That is how evolution happens, because of people who, by dint of their innate characteristics, or by dint of effort, or by dint of self-definition, are exceptional. That's a long conversation for now, but we must keep pushing on, you guys. We've got to keep pushing on, because we've got to get to everyone's, well, no, I was going to say everyone's least favorite character in the entire Harry Potter series, but that belongs to she who will not be named, but will show up very shortly, Ms. Umbridge. But our second least favorite character, at least I'm sure, is Miss Rita Skeeter. Rita Skeeter's smile widened. Harry counted 3 gold teeth. She reached again into her crocodile bag and drew out a long acid green quill and a roll of parchment, which she stretched out between them on a crate of Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover. She put the tip of the green quill into her mouth, sucked it for a moment with apparent relish, then placed it upright on the parchment, where it stood balanced on its point, quivering slightly. Testing. My name is Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet reporter. Harry looked down quickly at the quill. The moment Rita Skeeter had spoken, the green quill had started to scribble, skidding across the parchment. Attractive blonde Rita Skeeter, 43, whose savage quill has punctured many inflated reputations. Lovely, said Rita Skeeter yet again, as she ripped the top piece of parchment off, crumpled it up, and stuffed it into her handbag. Now she leaned toward Harry and said, So, Harry, what made you decide to enter the Triwizard Tournament? Said Harry again, but he was distracted by the quill. Even though he wasn't speaking, it was dashing across the parchment, and in its wake he could make out a fresh sentence. An ugly scar, souvenir of a tragic past, disfigures the otherwise charming face of Harry Potter, whose eyes— Ignore the quill, Harry, said Rita Skeeter firmly. Reluctantly, Harry looked up at her instead. Now, why did you decide to enter the tournament, Harry? We can all just shiver and maybe feel the need to wash our hands and take a shower right now. She is gross. She is the worst. And I'm curious how powerfully this specific archetype resonates with the American audience in particular, I think, because Rita Skeeter is emblematic of a very specific kind of British tabloid journalist. She is representative of a kind of British tabloid journalist that has been a fixture in British journalism since at the least the late 1970s, though really it was in the late 1970s that this trashy kind of tabloid journalism came into it waxed into its greatest popularity, I suppose, or began waxing into its greatest popularity, popularity that, to the mystification of most of us, I'm sure, endures to this present day. If you've read The Sun or The Star or God knows the Daily Mail, if you've been in Scotland and you've read the heinous rag that is the Daily Record in Scotland, these are terrible, terrible newspapers who actually in real life are engaged in this kind of journalism all the damn time. It is gross and foul. And at least my understanding of American tabloid journalism is that it leans into the complete fabrication and faux moral outrage a little more genuinely, I suppose. The bipolar hypocrisy of this kind of tabloid reporting in Britain is Shocking, absolutely shocking and sickening and depressing and foul. And Rita Skeeter is a perfect encapsulation of that. And it's no surprise, I think, that she shows up here in this book after J.K. Rowling has already met with a certain amount of success, after she has already, been a feature in a number of tabloid stories herself. There are two interesting things to kind of distill out of the presence of Rita Skeeter in this book. The first is that Rita Skeeter was not the original character. This was supposed to be a Hogwarts kid. This was supposed to be a Hogwarts kid writing for a Hogwarts school paper, which would perhaps have been, well, at the very least, as interesting and consistent, right? As a functional part of the narrative, would at least have worked just as well, wouldn't have broken the frame of Hogwarts quite as freely. I think the addition of Rita Skeeter to this plot actually manages to fragment the walls of Hogwarts itself still further and draws in that looming, voracious presence of the wider wizarding world into Harry's experience. The other thing, as I say, is that by this point, J.K. Rowling had achieved a certain amount of notoriety herself and was responding to her own relationship with the tabloids to a certain extent. In exactly the same way, I made this observation back when we were talking about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the Point North Media book club, the patron-exclusive book club, where in the first book in the Hitchhiker's Guide series, you can see Douglas Adams making a lot of jokes about being unemployed and not having any money and pubs. And then in the second and subsequent books of that series, after his success from The Hitchhiker's Guide, you can see him making a lot of jokes about golf and accountants and fine restaurants because his personal experience had changed so fully. Now, I think we see here a representation of the transformation of Rowling's experience, and that might invite us, were we so inclined, to draw some connections between Harry's experience of celebrity and Rowling's experience of celebrity. I'm less inclined to do that for all the numerous reasons that I've laid out before, talking about the primacy of the text and the power of the story itself and how we mustn't look for autobiographical interpretation of a narrative, because at the very least what we're going to get there is a dissatisfying piece of speculation about the life of J.K. Rowling and the creative process of J.K. Rowling, which I'm much less interested in than I am in the rich secondary world that she has created. But it is an interesting point of comparison at least. I do want to talk about her quill here. This is so foul. The significant moment here, because one possible interpretation, and I've seen this discussed on the internet a little bit, but one possible interpretation of the disassociation between Rita and her quill here is that actually she is not completely responsible for what is being written, for what is happening here. That the quill itself is embodied with some tonal sense of the Daily Prophet, right? That it has been infused with the Daily Prophet style guide and their kind of tonal register, and that the quill is writing this story based on her interviews and investigations. I do not take that to be true at all. She does express ownership over these stories. The quill is absolutely a tool. And I think the point of transition that we can see here, the point of empowerment that we can see here, is when she puts it in her mouth. She put the tip of the green quill into her mouth, sucked it for a moment with apparent relish, then placed it upright on the parchment. Obviously, the connection between her mouth and her speech and the quill itself is powerful. I don't take this to be a distracted affectation. I take this to be a charging up of the quill, the granting of her voice to this magical implement that is going to do more than simply report, is going to filter the experience either directly through Rita's through Rita's consciousness, I suppose, at this moment. That is to say that we are establishing some kind of creative link between Rita and the quill right now, or is just going to take a fragment of Rita's, what we might hesitantly call her creative sensibility, I suppose, and pour forth words that are very similar to those words that she has written. Let me see here. She is completely responsible, says Angela in all caps here. Yes, good. I feel terrible that I raised that whole question about American perspectives on tabloid newspapers and then didn't read the chat to find out what you all think. I would actually be fascinated by that. Take that conversation over to the forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum, which is actually still up and working, even though the website is currently down. The forum soldiers on. The forum continues. And obviously, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, then the website's back up, because I can't post the podcast version of this until the website is back up. Hello, Emily, who's joining us late here in the session. Good. Okay. Joseph is saying here, I think Rita is a great character. Also, she's an underappreciated journalist. Other than her reporting on Harry specifically, everything else she writes in the series is basically accurate and important, valuable reporting. Yes, may not be responsible reporting, But that would lead us into a whole conversation about the nature and role of the Fourth Estate, right? The nature and role of journalists of all forms, particularly newspaper journalists, in the response to severe social antagonism, I suppose. But yeah, we'll have opportunities to talk about Rita Skeeter again as we move forward. We do get here this great assertion from Harry that the tournament will be safer. Rita says, champions have died in the past, haven't they? Have you thought about that at all? And Harry replies, well, they say it's going to be a lot safer this year, Harry says, with, absolute faith and certainty in the words of Dumbledore, because this ties back to chapter 12, where Dumbledore says, there have been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate our tournament, none of which have been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. And this is the important sentence here. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time, no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. That is pretty much it. We also get the age line, of course, but the age line is not established in recognition of the fact that the tournament this year is going to be safer. It's quite the contrary. It's in recognition of the fact that the tournament is still going to be very dangerous for everyone involved. So Dumbledore has said, yeah, we've tried to make sure that no one's actually going to die, that no one is going to face mortal peril in the course of the Triwizard Tournament. But also, just to be on the safe side, let's make sure everyone is 17. Let's just do that. Harry, though, is secure here. Let's move into weighing the wands, because I've got a really interesting, or what I took to be a really interesting discussion here. And of course, we get the resolution of a point of speculation that we've been maintaining for a few chapters now about the nature of Fleur Delacour. Fleur Delacour swept over to Mr. Ollivander and handed him her wand. He said. He twirled the wand between his long fingers like a baton, and it emitted a number of pink and gold sparks. Then he held it close to his eyes and examined it carefully. Yes, he said quietly, 9.5 inches, inflexible, rosewood, and containing, dear me, an heir from the Edva Villa, said Fleur, one of my grandmothers. So Fleur was part Villa, thought Harry, making a mental note to tell Ron. Then he remembered that Ron wasn't speaking to him. Yes, said Mr. Ollivander. Yes, I've never used Vila hair myself. Of course, I find it makes for rather temperamental wands. However, to each his own, and if this suits you... Mr. Ollivander ran his fingers along the wand, apparently checking for scratches or bumps. Then he muttered, Orchideus! And a bunch of flowers burst from the wand tip. Very well, it's in fine working order, said Mr. Ollivander, scooping up the flowers and handing them to Fleur with her wand. Mr. Diggory, you next. Fleur glided back to her seat, smiling at Cedric as he passed her. How now, this is one of mine, isn't it? Said Mr. Ollivander with much more enthusiasm as Cedric handed over his wand. Yes, I remember it well, containing a single hair from the tail of a particularly fine male unicorn. Must have been 17 hands. Nearly gored me with his horn after I plucked his tail. 12.25 inches, ash, pleasantly springy. It's in fine condition. You treat it regularly? Polished it last night, said Cedric, grinning. Okay. Couple of things here right off the bat. Twirled the wand between his long fingers like a baton, like a, would you say, beau baton? Would you describe that as the way in which Mr. Ollivander wields Fleur Delacour's wand here? Note, too, the verbs that we associate, the movement verbs that we associate with Fleur Delacour here. She swept over to Mr. Ollivander. She glided back to her seat. We never get anything other than a stately procession from Fleur. She's always described in these charms, and it is just completely constant here. So obviously, the point that we are making here, the most important point here, is that Fleur's wand contains a Vila hair, a sufficiently magical item, a sufficiently magical artifact that it can provide the core for a wand. More importantly, an heir from the Ed of Avila, said Fleur, one of my grandmothers. Now, later, of course, we will learn, sadly, that Fleur's grandmother definitely died when that hair was plucked, because that's part of the Vila mythology. It was definitely in J.K. Rowling's head when she wrote this part. I'm being horribly snide about it for no good reason. This is an example of something which is partially retconned later with insufficient thought and care. There is no reason now to believe that Fleur's grandmother died because one of her hairs was plucked. It's just a perfectly straightforward thing. Harry's response here, so Fleur is part Vila, is important in a really interesting way. Actually, I believe that I have a question here from Joseph on this. I saw this earlier. Yes, Joseph asks in the questions box here, why does the revelation that Fleur is part Vila attract so little focus? In a book heavily interested with otherness, this seems like a real missed opportunity. Where is the Rita Skeeter expose? Her readers demand more. They absolutely would, yes. Why is this handled so lightly? Well, I think that you're right, Joseph, in that this is a book that is very concerned with others and othering, right? It is a book that is actively engaged in a dialogue with prejudice, in a sense, right? With notions of identity and the ways in which those clusters of identities interact, the fringe conditions, the boundary conditions between these bubbled Venn diagrams of identity and community and belonging. I suppose the bigger question is, why is Fleur part Vila? Why have we gone to the trouble of introducing Vila into this magical world and then making one of the primary characters in this unfolding plot, if not the unfolding story, part Vila? What does this mean? Why have we taken this measure here? And I don't necessarily want to state this too boldly, because this is something that I'm still working through and still considering and still figuring out. I don't want to assert this to be true. I want to raise it as a question for speculation. Is Fleur part Vila so that we can magically augment Ron's interest in her, so that we can magically justify Ron's interest in her? This is not about necessarily de-emphasizing or downplaying other romantic interests, which Ron may or may not have and may or may not explore in the future, but about getting him across that adolescent threshold so that he can be romantically interested in another character, so that he can be romantically interested in literally anyone. Of course, Ron has no choice but to be attracted to Fleur because she is part Vila. If that is the case, then the reveal here is interestingly downplayed, right? Because we're not necessarily putting the full weight of our exploration and emphasis on that. Though I do want to look at a kind of accompanying thought here. It's the use of the word silvery, right? Pops up in this chapter, and I went looking for uses of the word silvery specifically. Silvery with the Y is an uncommon word in English, kind of a borderline unacceptable word in English, but it is used by J.K. Rowling quite a lot, in fact. But it is always used by J.K. Rowling in very specific ways. It is used casually once that I can find in the 4 books that we have studied thus far. Every other time that it is used, it seems to me, with a great deal of care and a great deal of attention. Some of you who have been joining me for There and Back Again will know that I have been fascinated through the back half of The Two Towers by Professor Tolkien's repeated use of the phrase pale light, right? He likes to use pale light to indicate magic. And it seems to me that J.K. Rowling does something very similar with the use of the word silvery. So, in Philosopher's Stone, it is used 4 times. The word silvery appears 4 times. Interestingly, the first time that the word silvery appears in the Harry Potter series is to describe the eyes of Mr. Ollivander when Harry goes to Diagon Alley to get his wand in the first place. He's described as having silvery eyes. We then get it twice more in the course of Philosopher's Stone, describing the invisibility cloak, a very magical artifact indeed, and then once at the end of the book to describe unicorn blood. In Chamber of Secrets, it is used again to describe the invisibility cloak, and then used a 3rd time in that book to describe a spider web. When we're looking at the spiders who are fleeing Hogwarts halfway through Chamber of Secrets, we note that they are descending from the windowsill on a silvery strand of spiderweb. That is the only time that I think J.K. Rowling uses it without full attention and intention behind it. In Azkaban, we use it twice in our introduction to Professor Trelawney's divination class. The latter is described as being silvery, and then many of the crystal balls are described as being silvery too. And then, of course, it is used all the damn time through the back half of Prisoner of Azkaban, because we use it in association with Expecto Patronum, with the Patronus charm. We use it it's actually used right at the beginning of the book. The first time that Professor Lupin wards off the Dementors with the Patronus charm, we're given that sense of a silvery light. It crops up throughout that. In Goblet, to date, it has been used exclusively in regard to the Vila. We get it twice during the Quidditch World Cup right at the beginning of the book, where we talk about the light into which the Vila step as being silvery, and then, of course, the hair of the Vila themselves as being the hair of the Vila. Yeah, I suppose that is correct. It just felt ungainly. The Vila hair is also silvery, and then consistently it's used to describe Fleur's hair too. So silvery is used as a mark of enchantment. But generally speaking, it is not enchantment in the traditional Harry Potter sense, right? It's not associated with magic, right? We do a lot of green with magic. We do a certain amount of purple with magic too, a certain amount of gold with magic too. Those are, common colors in our descriptions of magical spells and effects. Silver is reserved for something more ethereal. Sorry, let me be more careful. Silvery is reserved for something more ethereal, something more otherworldly. If you think about basically the invisibility cloak and the Patronus charm and the Vela, we're looking at a very elevated kind of magic here. It is an ethereal kind of magic. And I just found that absolutely fascinating as I pushed through it. Yeah. Let me see here. Silver is one of the colors of Slytherin, says Lynn. Yes, absolutely. Silver is silvery. Would we describe that? Not so sure that we would. It certainly hasn't been, again, that specific version, silvery, has not been used with regard to Slytherin yet in the series. I haven't yet looked ahead, but you can be sure that I will, because I find this completely fascinating. Yeah, good. As Seastar's calling out here, will later, I think it's later, learn that unicorns are actually silver as adolescents and white as adults. It is later, and yes, the connection with silvery unicorn blood right back in the first book. Yeah, that's very strong. I'm charmed and fascinated. I'm sure I've spent too long talking about this already. Let's keep pushing on here, because we've got to get into, well, let's do Crumb's wand first. And then we'll get into chapter 19 here, the Hungarian Horntail. Mr. Ollivander sent a stream of silver smoke rings across the room from the tip of Cedric's wand, pronouncing himself satisfied, and then said, "Mr. Crumb, if you please." Victor Crumb got up and slouched, round-shouldered and duck-footed toward Mr. Ollivander. He thrust out his wand and stood scowling with his hands in the pockets of his robes. Said Mr. Ollivander. "This is a Grigorovich creation, unless I'm much mistaken. A fine wand maker, though his styling is never quite what I... However..." He lifted the wand and examined it minutely, turning it over and over before his eyes. "Yes, hornbeam and dragon heartstring," he shot at Crumb, who nodded. "Rather thicker than one usually sees. Quite rigid, 10¼ inches. Avis!" The hornbeam wand let off a blast like a gun, and a number of small twittering birds flew out of the end and through the open window into the watery sunlight. I do want to do some close reading on the 3 spells cast by Ollivander wielding the 3 wands of the other 3 champions, right? Harry excluded from this. Harry does not get a real spell from his wand, but the other 3 do. Fleur gets the Orchideus. She gets the flowers sprouting from the end of her wand. Cedric gets the stream of silver smoke rings across the room from the tip of his wand. And then we get this bird gun from the end of Victor's wand here. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, you guys. And I can't get there. I can't find it. I can't find the interesting analysis. I can't find the interesting interpretation of these particular spells. It seems obvious that we would associate flowers with Fleur. I mean, okay, there's obviously something there, both for her name and her femininity and that evocation of, romantic French Renaissance history. We've talked about the representations of Beauxbaton in the course of this book. So there's something there. The gunshot from Victor's wand, okay, I can kind of see that too, but no, I just can't find a unifying thesis here. There doesn't even seem to be anything terribly elemental, or at least not elemental in the way that we would expect the elemental associations to be made. If we're going literally here, then Fleur gets a representation of Earth here from her wand, even though she is more traditionally represented by air. And Victor gets air when he's more traditionally represented by water. And I suppose Cedric gets air too, like smoke rings would be air as well, even though he usually gets Earth. It doesn't quite hang together. I'm just not sure there's any there. So as much as I am inclined to do a close analysis on the cores of the wands and on the length of the wands and on the pliability of the wands, if you can see a connection between these things, then please, by all means, bring it on over to the forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum. Good. Let's get into our next chapter then. I'm probably not going to make it all the way through this chapter, but we will do our very best. We move into chapter 19, the Hungarian Horntail, and we see the consequence. Time is passing, of course, as it always does in these chapter transitions, right here in the middle of the book for J.K. Rowling. And time has passed at Hogwarts, and the Daily Prophet article has gone around, has been hanging around for weeks now, and Harry is getting more and more frustrated. The article had appeared 10 days ago, and Harry still got a sick, burning feeling of shame in his stomach every time he thought about it. Rita Skeeter had reported him saying an awful lot of things that he couldn't remember ever saying in his life, let alone in that broom cupboard. I suppose I get my strength from my parents. I know they'd be very proud of me if they could see me now. Yes, sometimes at night I still cry about them. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I know nothing will hurt me during the tournament because they're watching over me. But Rita Skeeter had gone even further than transforming his ers into long, sickly sentences. She had interviewed other people about him too. Harry has at last found love at Hogwarts. His close friend, Colin Creevey, says that Harry is rarely seen out of the company of one Hermione Granger, a stunningly pretty, muggle-born girl who, like Harry, is one of the top students in the school. For the moment the article had appeared, Harry had to endure people, Slytherins mainly, quoting it at him as he passed and making sneering comments. Here we see the Daily Prophet's habit of hyperbole has in no way been diminished, that Rita Skeeter has exaggerated every detail of Harry's experience here, has made melodramatic and operatic every detail of Harry's experience here, of Harry's life and history and personality, in order to garner the attention and the hypocritical sympathies of her readers. It's quite foul. Actually, it's quite foul is the problem. Though there are a couple of interesting fragments of potential truth here. I know nothing will hurt me during the tournament because they're watching over me is credited to Harry, even though he didn't say that. But is that a simple expression of faith in Harry Potter? Now, note that I'm not talking about Harry here. Harry did not say that and does not mean that and does not believe that, at least as far as we know. Like that is not a sentiment that Harry would ever express. But it is being written in the Daily Prophet, and it is being written as a part of a puff piece. It seems as though the spirit of this piece is actually very supportive of Harry. As we learn, the piece itself has been transformed into this entire account of Harry's life, I suppose, with the mention of the other champions in the Triwizard Tournament relegated to the very last line, crowded in and misspelled, which is a gorgeous detail from J.K. Rowling, crowded in and misspelled in the last line of the piece. So this is a positive puff piece about Harry, which means that the readers of the Daily Prophet would take this to be a positive statement of something. But what is it a positive statement of? Why is this included in the article? Is this a statement of faith? Is Harry acknowledging, is false, fake Rita Skeeter tabloid Harry, right? Is tabloid exclamation point Harry expressing here a religious sentiment? Is he expressing here a metaphysical or philosophical sentiment? Is he expressing here a magical sentiment? Do we have a notion of a wizard afterlife? We don't know how wizards feel about death. We don't know how wizards manifest death, not manifest in the Voldemort sense of the word, I suppose. We don't know how wizards apprehend death, I suppose is what I mean. I know nothing will hurt me during the tournament because they're watching over me. Do we mean in the Expecto Patronum sense? Or do we mean in the looking down on me from heaven beyond the pearly gates kind of sense? Because either one of those thoughts is interesting and challenging to our understanding of the wizarding world. We then get the second kind of incidental detail here. Did Rita Skeeter talk to Colin Creevey? Did Colin Creevey say that Hermione was stunningly pretty? Is any of this real? Is any of this true? Well, I have no troubles thinking that Colin probably told her that Harry and Hermione hang out a lot, but I'm not sure that description would have come from him. But stunningly pretty muggle-born girl. Yeah. And again, you'll note there, muggle-born, othering, right? As Joseph was observing earlier, we are still exaggerating the qualities, or the Daily Prophet here is exaggerating the qualities of those who we find to be interesting by othering them. Those people, they are not like us. And that is actually a pretty consistent part of the tabloid pendulum, right? We love to build up and inflate, and then we love to tear down the inflated. Or to puncture the inflated, I suppose, if we can go back to the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban and consider that metaphor. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's keep pushing on because we've got to get to Hogsmeade. So Harry is awful to Hermione, basically not being fully appreciative of her friendship, though he is under enormous stress and duress. He finally agrees to go to Hogsmeade with her, but because he doesn't want to deal with his public, he's going to go under his invisibility cloak and not spend time with his friend. Really, it's not great for Harry, but this is the scene that we get in Hogsmeade. Yeah, right, said Harry. He took a swig of butterbeer under his cloak. Hermione, when are you going to give up on that spew stuff? When house elves have decent wages and working conditions, she hissed back. You know, I'm starting to think it's time for more direct action. I wonder how you get into the school kitchens. No idea. Ask Fred and George, said Harry. Hermione lapsed into thoughtful silence while Harry drank his butterbeer, watching the people in the pub. All of them looked cheerful and relaxed. Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott were swapping chocolate frog cards at a nearby table, both of them sporting support Cedric Diggory badges on their cloaks. Right over by the door, he saw Cho and a large group of her Ravenclaw friends. She wasn't wearing a Cedric badge, though. That cheered Harry up very slightly. What wouldn't he have given to be one of these people, sitting around laughing and talking with nothing to worry about but homework? He imagined how it would have felt to be here if his name hadn't come out of the Goblet of Fire. He wouldn't be wearing his invisibility cloak, for one thing. Ron would be sitting with him. The three of them would probably be happily imagining what deadly dangerous task the school champions would be facing on Tuesday. He'd been really looking forward to it, watching them do whatever it was, cheering on Cedric with everyone else, safe in a seat at the back of the stands. This is a representation of Harry's transition back to a pre-adolescent, I suppose not pre-adolescent, but at least early adolescent experience of Hogwarts, to an earlier experience, a Harry-specific earlier experience of Hogwarts. Here, because of the challenge of the first task of the Triwizard Tournament, he is reappraising his time. This thought of being not specifically at Hogsmeade, but back at Hogwarts is something that has worn on him right at the end of the school holidays. You'll remember how we discussed that at the time, how we discussed that earlier in today's session. This is Harry reappraising that. Now that he is facing mortal danger, now that he has been made exceptional, now that he is no longer a part of his community, he has been exiled from his community by either those school kids who are choosing to support Cedric Diggory, those school kids who are skeptical of Harry's involvement in the Triwizard Tournament at all, or in the context of the Gryffindor kids, by them fating him to an even higher and greater degree, right? That recognition of his exceptionalism also drives him out of his community. And now he's thinking fondly of that community, wishing, hey, wouldn't it be cool if everything was just back to normal? Wouldn't it be great if I could just sit here with my friends? Wouldn't it be awful? Wouldn't it be awesome if I didn't have to be hiding under the invisibility cloak that I completely voluntarily chose to put on? Yeah, maybe. Because it turns out, Harry, that you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Calling out again here, Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott swapping chocolate frog cards. There we have a really interesting, as I mentioned earlier, right? Ernie and Justin, representative of Ron and Harry, respectively. Here we get Ernie and Hannah, representative of Ron and Hermione, respectively. I like that dynamic, and I like the way that it is echoed. And of course, we get the ever charming Cho. Yes, good. Let's. Oh, this is interesting. C-Star says, so who told Rita that Hermione is Muggle-born? You know, that hadn't occurred to me at all. That's really interesting. Yeah. And Joseph's asking, I really hope Ernie and Hannah ended up together. They probably had a weekly board game night with Justin Finch-Fletchley, who remains a bachelor. Wow. I like that. C-Star confirms that Pottermore does not support that interpretation, but you know what, Joseph? You and I support that interpretation. I would like that very much. Yes. Good. Good. All right. Let's keep pushing ever onward here. Oh, gosh, I'm running out of time as I knew that I would. We're about to transition to talk of dragons, and we're a little light on next week's. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll make this the last slide for this week, and then we'll, because unfortunately this afternoon, as I always do in the afternoon sessions, I have a hard out because schools won't just keep your kids forever, it turns out. Unless it's Hogwarts, I suppose. As Harry watched, he saw Hagrid and Moody get up to leave. He waved, then remembered that Hagrid couldn't see him. Moody, however, paused, his magical eye on the corner where Harry was standing. He tapped Hagrid on the small of his back, being unable to reach his shoulder, muttered something to him, and then the pair of them made their way back across the pub toward Harry and Hermione's table. "All right, Hermione," said Hagrid loudly. "Hello," said Hermione, smiling back. Moody limped around the table and bent down. Harry thought he was reading the SPEW notebook until he muttered, "Nice cloak, Potter." Harry stared at him in amazement. The large chunk missing from Moody's nose was particularly obvious at a few inches' distance. Moody grinned. Can you... "Yeah, it can see through invisibility cloaks," Moody said quietly. "And it's come in useful at times, I can tell you." Hagrid was beaming down at Harry too. Harry knew Hagrid couldn't see him, but Moody had obviously told Hagrid he was there. Hagrid now bent down on the pretext of reading the SPEW notebook as well, and said in a whisper so low that only Harry could hear it, "Harry, meet me tonight at midnight at me cabin. Wear that cloak." The plot thickens. And we're going to talk next time about rules and lines of responsibility. We're going to talk about authority. We're going to talk about feigned authority. We're going to talk about the rules not as a superstructure for society, but a performance that assures us a pantomime of society, if you like. Because let's be perfectly honest, the rules for the Triwizard Tournament, as stern and as austere as they were when they were first laid out for us by Dumbledore, are pretty irrelevant as we move through the rest of this book. So we'll talk more about that as we get into next week's reading. But here we have to observe the brilliant detail that Moody can pierce the veil of invisibility afforded Harry by his cloak. His magical eye is capable of doing so much more than simply rolling around in the back of his head and watching kids in the midst of class. This is strong stuff, and still allows us to keep Moody in that space where he is a fascinating character who is not quite integrated yet, though even now he is having drinks with Hagrid, who has up until this point kind of occupied that space of a fascinating character who hasn't been completely integrated. We talked about this way back when, maybe in our discussion of the second book, the fact that Hagrid has this dual identity, if you like, that he is associated with Hogwarts, that if you list people who are at Hogwarts or who work for Hogwarts, Hagrid is going to be pretty close to the top of that list, and yet he lives outside the school bounds. He lives off on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. He lives on his own terms. He is still, in large part, in exile from the broader wizarding community. That's a fascinating point of distinction, which is going to be all the more relevant for Mad-Eye Moody as we progress through the rest of this book. Okay, great, good. Okay, let me cancel. In fact, let me skip ahead here. I will cancel this slide and then skip ahead so that I can show you next week's reading. Next week's reading, we will finish off the rest of this chapter, the handful of slides that we have for this chapter, and then we will cover Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, chapters 20 and 21, The First Task, and the House Elf Liberation Front. That will be next week in the evening, next Tuesday evening at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on March 13th, 2018. So we'll finish up chapter 19, go through chapter 20, which is pretty thorough. That's a really interesting chapter. And then rush through chapter 21, which doesn't really have that much going on in it anyway. So that'll work out quite nicely, you guys, as we talk about dragons and more next week on Dear Mr. Potter. Let me take a quick look. I have 5 minutes here as I can take a look at some questions. We've already answered that question from Joseph. Quick callback to Buffy's The Yoko Factor, says Tom brackets not Riddle. Do all or most power trios or groups have that toxic codependency that will eventually rend them apart? That's a really big question, actually, Tom. That's a really, really big question. In long-running fiction, more often than not, you will find characters ultimately addressing that toxic codependency toward the end of their story. As we begin to arc characters into independent resolution, we will usually start to address the dynamics of the group itself. That's true whether we're talking about, the Buffy power trio of Buffy, Xander, and Willow, which is, of course, beautifully representative of, emblematic of, reminiscent of the Harry Potter power trio too. Or if you prefer, the expanded Buffy 5-man band, where we also include Giles and, well, sometimes Cordelia, sometimes Oz. It's fluid, it changes, it's all fine. It depends on where we are in the story. Sometimes Dawn, even as we move through the latter seasons of Buffy there. Yes, we actually do begin to address those insufficiencies, those internal insufficiencies, because as characters become more fully developed and realized themselves, we de-emphasize those codependent relationships and instead emphasize independence of character, independence of thought, independence of will, independence of emotional security, all of these good adult things, which is one of the reasons why these power dynamics generally are more commonly found in adolescent and YA fiction, I would say, than in adult fiction, though you can trivially kind of spin this out into a conversation about, the crew of the Enterprise, right? One of the most powerful and pop culturally significant power trios that you will ever get in pop fiction, in popular fiction, is Kirk and Spock and McCoy from the original series of Star Trek, with Kirk embodying that ethos impulse, right? He is literally empowered by his position and by his character to take action, to make decisions, to do the thing, and he has the rationalistic Hermione Spock on one shoulder and the empathetic and passionate Ron Bones McCoy on the other shoulder. And that isn't dysfunctional in a sense, although arguably, as you move through the Star Trek movies, you might even argue that it is a little bit dysfunctional. Yeah, yes. Generally speaking, we start to de-emphasize these toxic codependencies and assert a greater sense of independence, but that's not every kind of story, right? Stories which are interested in the coming to terms with the passage of time, most notably adolescent stories and YA fiction, because that adolescent period cannot last forever. So as our characters mature, we necessarily embark upon a voyage of self-discovery, which stresses these character dynamics and character relationships. Or in the context of Star Trek, the notion of becoming older, the notion of aging out of your adventures is also powerful in that regard. But not every story is about that. Not every story is interested in dealing with evolution through the passage of time. Evolution, of course, character development is important in every story, but what I mean is not every story is interested in what age and the passage of time means for these characters. Not every story is arcing characters toward a new status quo or even a new journey, a new voyage of discovery. Not every story is interested in doing that, and stories which aren't interested in doing that are necessarily going to be less inclined to study these character dynamics and the breaking points therein. But yeah, it is pretty common. Let me see here, a question from Nikki. Apart from story convention, do you think there's a reason that Dumbledore or any of the other professors never cleared up the impossibility of Harry putting his name in the cup? Would they not want to scare the students and therefore let Harry take the brunt of the resentment and suspicion? Would they not find it a big deal? Joseph replies to this in the question box here. I interpret it as teachers being oblivious to the social dynamics among students. Lots of bullying happens without teachers being aware. They don't know that they need to do anything. Alternative explanation, Dumbles doesn't want whoever is behind this to know that they are onto him or her. That is my explanation. That is my preferred explanation, Joseph, is some of the faculty at Hogwarts don't care. Professor Sprout doesn't care. Professor Snape doesn't care. Hagrid does care, but is caring in a very proactive way, I suppose, in a very specific and proactive way. My interpretation of this is that McGonagall and Dumbledore know damn fine that Harry didn't put his name into the Goblet of Fire and suspect in full measure that someone else did in order to endanger Harry or for some other nefarious purpose, and that they are, as we speak, investigating that possibility, or at least moving toward the protection of Harry. Next week, when we finish up this chapter, we're going to get the account from Sirius, as Harry speaks to him through the fire in the Gryffindor Tower. We're going to get the account from Sirius about Mad-Eye Moody being the world's greatest Auror, basically, and that being the explanation for Dumbledore's employing him this year for the Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts position. That is why Dumbledore wants Moody there, is because he knows that Harry is going to be targeted and he wants an Auror on the staff. That may well be the case, but that is certainly my interpretation. Is there another interpretation? No, not really. I don't think that we've seen anything from Dumbledore that would suggest that he would allow the appearance of propriety to prevent him from taking care of his student body, from preventing him from protecting and properly leading and moderating his student community. I don't think that we've seen any indication that would be the case. I think that my preferred explanation is therefore, yes, let's pretend that everything is fine so that whoever did this doesn't know that we're onto them. That's the best explanation as far as I can see it. But yeah, I'm not so sure. Let me see here. Rayla Lynn says here in the chat, we'll make this our last question for today. Rita is definitely unlikable, says Rayla Lynn, but does she deserve what happens? I assume that when the birds came from Crumb's wand, it's a metaphor for Crumb on the Broom. Okay. Rayla Lynn has tricked me and embedded 3 or 4 questions here. Let me see. I assume that the birds coming from Crumb's wand is a metaphor for Crumb on his broom. I like that. Okay. Yes. Even the gunshot there, like that propulsive athleticism. Yes. Still not quite sure that I get it. As I say, the flowers for Fleur, okay. Gunshot athleticism for Victor Crumb, okay. I'm still not sure about the smoke rings for Cedric Diggory. I'm still not sure what that representation would be, unless, I, of course, being the fan that I am of the works of Professor Tolkien, immediately associate smoke rings with hobbits, right? I immediately associate smoke rings with hobbits. And as I've said before, Hufflepuffs are kind of hobbits. From the Hufflepuff common room to their desire for comfort and camaraderie and community, they are kind of hobbity. So I wonder if there's a connection there. It's not a compelling connection, I have to admit. But yes, that would be the best that I can do to kind of interpret that right now. Let me see here. I always assumed Snape was in the room before 4 Champions because Dumbledore had him watching Karkaroff and whoever put Harry's name in. Thoughts? Gosh, now you're questioning me. I have no idea. Do we get the account of Snape coming? I feel as though we get I feel as though the narrative tells us that Snape comes into that room, but I don't now recall. I will look into that for next week because that would give us a really interesting perspective on Karkaroff. Yes, good. Okay. Amelie says smoke rings, letting off smoke, assign something maybe in distress. Distress smoke I can see, but then I feel that the symbol or the metaphor is muddied slightly by having them be rings, which are, usually a product of smoking, of pipe smoke rather than that. But yeah, possibly. Interesting. All right, you guys, that brings us up to time, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for joining me this week. As I say, next week we'll be back into our regular evening slot, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, March 13th, 2018, for the end of Chapter 19, into Chapter 20, into Chapter 21. Next week, we get our first test. Next week, we actually pass the halfway point of the novel, which I'm amazed by. I've been talking about the first half of this book because, as I said, structurally we've passed the first half of the book some time ago, but now we're actually going to pass the physical halfway point in the book next week, and I cannot wait to talk about these chapters. Thank you all so much for your company. Thank you all so much for your time. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, mischief managed. Take care, everybody.